Greetings, where every tale unfolds like a chat over a cozy cup of coffee. Today I present to you an enchanting new mystery starring the ever-observant and brilliantly astute Miss Marple, the cherished amateur sleuth crafted by Agatha Christie. Settle in and let's delve into this delightful puzzle together. And if you feel inclined, drop a quick comment to share where you're joining from. It's always a joy to connect with our little detective community. Now, let's embark on this journey with Miss Marple and the corpse in. Room 13 at St. Mildred's Vicarage had been quite insistent after her recent unpleasant cold. Miss Merrill simply must get some sea air. With her usual neat practicality, she packed a sensible wardrobe and booked herself into the Royal Gull Hotel, a place recommended by an old acquaintance from her Girl Guide days. The Royal Gull sat perched at the edge of a rather windswept promenade, a once elegant Edwardian hotel now quietly resigned to its present existence as a refuge for middle-class holidaymakers, the sort who traveled with good stout shoes, folding umbrellas, and a dependable flask of brandy for emergencies. The hall porter, a lanky young man with the vague air of someone perpetually distracted, handled Miss Mell's luggage with cheerful incompetence, setting her hat box upside down and misplacing her umbrella almost immediately. Miss Marple's eye wandered over the reception hall, tarnished brass fittings, a framed menu for a long-discontinued gala dinner, and a collection of seaside postcards curling at the edges. All perfectly ordinary, except for the notice board where a small printed card was hastily pinned to the door. Room 13, closed for maintenance. Curious, Miss Merrill thought, for a hotel so fully booked that they had only just managed to find her a room. Perhaps this was a matter for further quiet investigation. She signed the register with a precise hand, noting without seeming to do so that room 13 had no name written beside it. "Such a lucky thing we had a cancellation, dear," said the receptionist with brittle brightness. "I've put you just next door, room 12. Lovely SE view." Miss Merrill, with the mildest of smiles, thanked her and uttered not a word. The hotel room was just as anticipated. Endearingly worn, the wallpaper displayed a bright, yet faded pattern of carnations, and the dressing table wobbled slightly. When touched, the view was at least satisfying, a gray restless sea beneath an equally gray sky. Miss Merrill unpacked with her usual efficiency, smoothing her shawl over the back of the armchair and placing her knitting next to the tea tray. Through the thin walls, she could hear the cheerful clatter of crockery and a wireless playing dance music from somewhere. In the distant ballroom, the soft murmur of voices wafted up from the reception hall. As she fastened her brooch, she caught the first whisper, one not meant for guests' ears. A low, urgent voice drifted up from the landing below. "If they've put her next to that room, well, it's not my fault," a girl's voice remarked. "I told Mrs. Sanderford they should just brick it up proper like." Another voice, older and sharper, snapped back with a warning. Then, silence enveloped the space. Miss Merrill stood perfectly still. For a brief instant, the chatter surrounding the hotel sparkled with the same intrigue as that of the village, provided one possessed the skill to listen attentively. The distinction, naturally, lay in the villagers' familiarity with one another, which made deception a rare occurrence. In contrast, hotel guests and staff displayed a flair for creativity. She returned to her knitting, hands moving deftly while her mind remained alert. When the bellboy delivered her tea moments later, Miss Marr's demeanor was as gentle as ever. "Tell me, dear," she inquired softly, "do you often encounter issues with room 13? The chambermaid, a rosy-cheeked girl named Gladys, was easily flustered and, with a palpable sense of intrigue, she leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, I really shouldn't say anything, miss," she began, but couldn't help herself. "It's just that room has had a strange reputation since before the war. Things go missing in there, you know. Once, there was a guest who simply vanished, no forwarding address, no luggage left behind, just gone." The receptionist, catching wind of the conversation, hurried over with a laugh that felt forced, her eyes betraying a hint of skepticism. "Nonsense, dear," she chimed in cheerfully. "Guests always let their imaginations run wild in old hotels. Room 13 is perfectly ordinary. It's only bad luck if you choose to believe it. In it, we sensible ladies don't Miss Merrill, who is both eminently sensible and privately fascinated by human nature's fondness for superstition." She merely smiled, of course, agreeing while folding her knitting carefully. But I always find unlucky rooms to be terribly interesting, don't you? That evening, the wind rose sharply, rattling the sash windows and sending the faintest smell of salt through the cracks. Miss Marple, her tea finished and her bed neatly turned down, sat quietly knitting by the window. She had always found it easier to think with her hands. Occupied, the corridor outside was hushed, the polite silence of hotel guests reading or dozing after dinner. Then, quite distinctly, she heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft shuffle of a guest moving cautiously to the bathroom, nor the brisk step of a porter. These were heavy, deliberate footsteps, pausing outside room 13. A soft metallic click, as though a key were turning, then silence. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and opened her door just a crack. The corridor was empty, or appeared to be. Room 13's door stood ajar, though the receptionist had insisted it was locked, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then, the door gently swung shut, as if pushed by an invisible force. Miss Marple, her eyes alight with curiosity, quietly closed her own door. That night, she slept fitfully, for nothing is more captivating than a mystery that taps at one's own walls. It was the chambermaid's scream that roused Miss Marple, a sharp, piercing sound that sliced through the tranquil hush of the seaside dawn. By the time she had donned her dressing gown and stepped into the corridor, half the guests had already congregated, much like hens around a fallen egg. Room 13 was the subject of hushed whispers as Gladys, trembling and clutching her apron, announced, "There's a man lying there, quite dead, I think." The corridor hummed with speculation. The Royal Gull was the kind of hotel where little ever transpired, aside from the occasional mix-up with the breakfast tray. Thus, the discovery of a corpse in that very room stirred considerable agitation. Miss Marple, her face composed yet her eyes sparkling with curiosity, allowed herself to be gently jostled toward the scene. In the doorway, there lay a man of late middle age, unnaturally still on the narrow bed. His clothes were rumpled, his shoes muddy, and in his hand, he clutched a single gold cuff linked tightly between his fingers. No one recognized him. "Not one of ours," whispered Mrs. Sanderford, twisting her hands. "I know every guest. I make a point of it." "But how did he get in?" asked Mrs. Whittaker, a mix of delight and horror in her voice. The room was supposed to be empty. This, Miss Marple felt, was precisely the question. She withdrew discreetly, leaving others to flutter and fuss around the scene. Her encounter with a lifeless body in an unforeseen location was seldom a matter of chance. She slipped back to her room, lost in thought about the gold cufflink. Such items were deeply personal, often exchanged as gifts, and in Miss Marple's extensive experience, gifts had a knack for revealing tales if one paid close attention. By breakfast, the atmosphere was charged with speculation. Guests filtered into the dining room, their expressions taut with intrigue, each stealing covert looks at one another, as if anticipating the presence of a killer. As she buttered her toast, Miss Marple settled into her familiar spot, discreet, yet perfectly positioned to take in the scene. At one table, Mrs. Whittaker, flushed with enthusiasm, animatedly shared her version of Gladys's discovery, seemingly unconcerned with the truth. Meanwhile, Mr. Pritchard, the reserved gentleman from room 15, managed to spill his tea twice, his hands trembling noticeably. Colonel Denby, wearing a disgruntled expression and clearly feeling the repercussions of last night's excess, made loud declarations about the current state of hotels and the outrageous absence of proper security. Mrs. Sanderford hovered at the door, her smile brittle and her eyes darting nervously from guest to guest. Miss Marple found the whole tableau fascinating. No one, she noted, seemed genuinely surprised. Yes, but not shocked. This suggested that whatever lay behind the corpse in room 13, someone here had expected trouble, if not precisely this particular trouble. As her porridge cooled, Miss Marple mentally sorted faces into categories. Those who knew something and those who knew nothing but dearly wished they did. And then there was Mr. Pritchard, who kept his eyes firmly on his plate but jumped every time the dining room door creaked open. Interesting, thought Miss Marple, very interesting indeed. Later that morning, Miss Marple found Mrs. Sanford straightening cushions in the lounge with rather more force than the task required. "Such a terrible business," Miss Marple said gently. But of course these things do happen in hotels. Mrs. Sanford's smile stretched tight, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. Nothing like this ever happens. Here, she said quickly. We are a respectable family-run establishment that has been in operation for 30 years. It's all just a horrible mistake. A mistake. Miss Marple tilted her head politely. I mean, Mrs. Sanford, she corrected herself. Whoever he was, he had no business being in room 13. The room wasn't even occupied last night. Her voice rose slightly on the final word, and her fingers fluttered over her throat. Miss Marple offered a soothing smile. Of course, dear, I'm sure it's nothing at all. These mix-ups happen everywhere. But Mrs. Sanford's fingers continued to tremble, and Miss Marple made a mental note. Those who tell small lies to sidestep scandal often hide much larger truths beneath. That afternoon, Miss Mel found herself sharing tea with Colonel Denby, who had fortified himself with more whiskey than the hours strictly required. Dreadful, peculiar business, he said, with the air of a man who had longed all his life for a dramatic incident to unfold in his immediate vicinity. Indeed, said Miss Mel mildly. The colonel leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Saw someone last night, you know. He mentioned that just after midnight. It crept up the stairs like a cat. Did you recognize them? Well, no, the colonel admitted after a pause. He had indulged in a bit of a nightcap, you see. But I remember the cloak long and dark, almost touching the floor. How very odd, said Miss Marple with genuine interest. A cloak like that, so old-fashioned. The colonel nodded solemnly, clearly relishing his moment as a man of importance. Miss Marple smiled, but behind her gentle expression, her mind was already at work. She had long observed that men who drank too much tended to talk. Too often, she accidentally stumbled upon the truth, and now she was convinced that someone in the Royal Gull was concealing much more than just a cloak. Mrs. Whittaker, wrapped in a knitted shawl adorned with a dramatic paisley border, made her entrance into the lounge with the poise of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Of course, I sensed something was amiss. She began, fixing her small audience with a knowing look. The creaking floorboards, for one thing, it's an old house. Yes, but that wasn't the usual sort of creak. And then there was the tap, tap, tap on the windowsill at about midnight, like someone signaling. You see, Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly, her expression politely interested. And then, of course, there was the smell. Mrs. Whittaker went on, quite unmistakable, strong as anything cigar smoke. I said to myself, and I was right. It's all very distressing. Mrs. Sanderford interrupted, her voice tight, but Mrs. Whittaker was not to be silenced. Mark my words, she concluded, leaning in confidentially, these things never happen without a woman being involved somewhere. It was always the same, likely a jealous wife, or worse. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was a familiar tune, yet she understood that even the wildest village gossip often concealed a kernel of truth. Mr. Pritchard lingered near the fireplace, his thin hands hovering uncertainly over a newspaper he didn't seem to be reading. Miss Marple, having spent decades observing shy church organists, nervous bachelors, and anxious spinsters, recognized the particular unease of a man who knew more than he dared admit. Terrible business, she said kindly, settling into the chair beside him. But I suppose you've encountered worse in your time. Mr. Pritchard flinched. I keep to myself mostly, he stammered. Came here for the quiet, you know. Of course, said Miss Marple. But it's funny, isn't it? A man turning up dead in a room that's supposed to be empty. Mr. Pritchard gave a thin, watery smile. Unlucky, I suppose. Miss Marple's eyes remained on her knitting, but her thoughts settled firmly on Mr. Pritchard. Unlucky, yes, or something very much worse. Later, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet moment to consider the scene. Room 13 held a somber scene, the cufflinks still grasped tightly in the rigid fingers of the corpse, its surface catching the morning light in a muted gleam. It was an ornate piece, reminiscent of an era long past, not something one would expect a traveler to wear. The lingering scent of cigar smoke hung in the air, despite the window being thrown wide open. Then there was the floor by the back door, marked by a muddy trail of footsteps that led partway inside before abruptly disappearing, as if someone had wiped their feet halfway through entering. Miss Marple examined each detail with her characteristic gentleness. Individually, the details were unexceptional, Yet collectively they hinted at something quite specific, something often dismissed as mere coincidence by those hesitant to acknowledge a deeper link. It was Gladys, still wide-eyed with a mix of excitement and dread, who retrieved the register at Miss Marr's gentle urging. "See for yourself," she said, breathlessly. Room 13 had not even been occupied the previous night. Miss Marple traced a steady finger down the page, scanning the tidy list of names pinned in Mrs. Sandford's meticulous hand. Mr. Pritchard. In room 15, Colonel Denby. In room 11, Miss Marple herself. In room 12 and room 13, entirely blank. Odd. Miss Marple murmured. So very odd. She shut the register gently, her mind already turning. A corpse without a name was always trouble, particularly in a hotel with a reputation for unlucky rooms. By Miss Marple's reckoning, this wasn't the first time room 13 had a story to tell, and she rather suspected it would not be the last. Mrs. Whittaker had taken up residence in the lounge after breakfast, her knitting needles clacking energetically over what seemed to be an ambitious pair of socks. Miss Marple, equally industrious, had settled herself nearby, her own needles moving at a steady, thoughtful pace. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Whittaker began without preamble. "You'd never think it in a respectable place like this." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "Hotels do seem to attract such extraordinary incidents, though all those strangers, you know, people with past lives no one knows a thing about." Mrs. Whittaker nodded emphatically, delighted to have found a receptive audience. "Mark my words, it's always. In these instances, one might find matters of gambling debts or the plight of a certain woman." She spoke softly, her eyes sparkling with intrigue. "They claim the room was devoid of life, yet I have my doubts." Miss Marple peered over her spectacles, noting the faint glow beneath the door, quite late indeed. The footsteps were heavy, far from what one would anticipate from a guest at the seaside. Miss Marple nodded in agreement, mentally cataloging the detail. Footsteps in an unoccupied room always pique curiosity, especially when they coincide with other peculiarities. With murmurs surrounding the room's infamous reputation, Mrs. Whittaker declared with a flourish that it was the ill-fated room 13, where nothing good ever transpired. Miss Marple offered a faint smile. In her experience, luck had little bearing on murder. Yet, she recognized that people clung to their superstitions more than they cared to confess, and those beliefs, Miss Marple understood, often stemmed from very real occurrences, waiting to be unraveled beneath the surface. Later that morning, she discovered Mrs. Sandford in the office, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the ledger, as if she could erase the past with a mere touch. The entire unfortunate incident, if only she had put in more effort, such a dreadful misunderstanding. Mrs. Sandford sighed, lamenting, "If only we had been aware of what dear Miss Marple's tone conveyed gentle curiosity. It was the rooms, you see." Mrs. Sandford bit her lip, recalling the last-minute changes, 2 guests who canceled, and then a party that insisted on adjoining rooms. "I suppose the night porter mixed things up. Room 13 was never meant to be occupied at all." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as Mrs. Sandford whispered about the poor man who died. "That's just it. He wasn't on the register, no luggage, no booking, nothing. It was as if he just appeared. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "he was looking for someone else's room altogether." Mrs. Sandford's eyes widened. "Oh, you don't think?" "I think," Miss Marple interjected, "that sometimes the wrong person opens the wrong door, and that can lead to all sorts of trouble." She folded her knitting neatly, her mind already moving toward the next question. Who precisely was the room meant for? It was Gladys who mentioned the telegram as she entered the lounge. Arms laden with linen, her face flushed with barely contained excitement, she remarked, quite uninvited, that a telegram had been intended for room 13 but had been misdelivered to the wrong tray. Miss Marple's knitting had come to a halt. She pondered who it was for, noting only the initial M. Gladys leaned in closer, clearly relishing the unfolding drama. Mrs. Sandford appeared quite flustered, suggesting it must have been an old mistake, perhaps from years past. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment. In her experience, people often claimed things were mistakes when they were far too afraid to believe otherwise, and the message itself, Miss Marple asked in her most innocent tone. "Oh, the usual sort of thing, urgent, Must speak immediately. That sort, Gladys said cheerfully. Though why anyone would be so desperate to contact someone at the Royal Gull, I can't imagine. Miss Marple could imagine very well indeed. Messages like that were rarely for pleasant reasons. More often than not, they were the final stitch in a pattern of blackmail, desperation, or fear, and she reflected on a telegram intended for A.M. holds a certain enigma that could unravel numerous mysteries, if only one could discern the identity of M. Miss Marple discovered Colonel Denby napping in the sunlight, his head bobbing over a copy of the Times. At her gentle cough, he jolted awake, blinking as if emerging from a troubling dream. Awful business, he remarked without delay. Awful indeed, replied Miss Marple, as she settled into the chair beside him. And so very mysterious. The colonel cleared his throat, his confidence wavering slightly. I expect you heard I saw someone last night. Only whispers. Of course, miss. Marple said modestly. One never knows what to believe. The colonel puffed up slightly, clearly relishing his position as a witness of importance. It was after midnight, he said. I'd gone to fetch my flask from the sideboard. That's when I saw them creeping up the stairs. Really? Miss Marple's voice was gently encouraging. Tall, I'd say, wearing one of those long cloaks, old-fashioned, almost theatrical. Did you recognize them? The colonel hesitated. Truth is, I'd had a spot of whiskey beforehand, so I might not have seen as clearly as I. Consider how very reasonable it was, Miss Marple remarked gently. Still, a cloak is quite a theatrical choice, isn't it? Almost akin to a disguise. The colonel nodded wisely, oblivious to the fact that Miss Marple's thoughts had already woven a subtle connection between the cloak, the telegram, and the room that ought to have been vacant. Of course, Miss Marple continued, her knitting resuming. Those who wander about in cloaks often have something they prefer to keep hidden. The colonel grunted in agreement, completely unaware that Miss Marple had already begun to observe the pattern taking shape amidst the tangled threads of gossip, confusion, and fear. Mrs. Whittaker's enthusiasm for the unfolding drama showed no signs of diminishing after lunch. She summoned Miss Marple to the lounge, exuding the air of someone about to reveal a significant discovery. You'll think me silly, dear Mrs. Whittaker began, already too pleased with herself to sound even remotely apologetic. But I saw something rather odd last night. Miss Marple, who had learned over the years that the peculiarities noted by impulsive gossips were often less strange than they seemed, merely nodded. Softly, after I had finished my cocoa, Mrs. Whittaker continued, I had just drawn the curtains when I noticed a woman slipping out the side door. A woman? Miss Marple inquired gently. Quite unmistakable, dear Tallish, in a dark cloak, very old-fashioned, sweeping right down to her ankles. And of course, I thought at once, that's peculiar, because none of the guests here dress like that. I would certainly have noticed. And her face? Miss Marple asked. Well, that's the thing, Mrs. Whittaker said, leaning forward dramatically. I couldn't see it. It was hidden. Under the hood. How intriguing, Miss Marple remarked, her tone so gently neutral that only the keenest ear might detect the subtle flicker of interest beneath. Privately, Miss Marple catalogued this alongside Colonel Den's hazy recollection of a cloaked figure. Between the two of them, neither particularly reliable, they had sketched the outline of someone who ought not to have been present at all. Mrs. Whittaker reclined, pleased with her input, while Miss Marple's thoughts quietly shifted to the kind of individuals who still donned cloaks, not for the sake of fashion. For the sake of staying unnoticed, Miss Marple, who understood that the most valuable discussions seldom occurred in drawing rooms, quietly and unobtrusively made her way to the back hallway by the service entrance. It was in that space, nestled between a coat rack and a heap of worn suitcases, that the true essence of hotel gossip thrived. Two chambermaids, Gladys and her companion Eddie, were engaged in hushed conversation, with Eddie leisurely folding napkins. It's not natural, that room, Eddie remarked. Never was, not even when I first. It began here, an unfortunate turn of events, as Gladys had concurred. They ought to have sealed it off after the previous incident. Miss Marple bent down to fix her shoe, a flawless pretext for lingering. After the last time, she remarked cheerfully, as if she had stumbled into the conversation by chance. Ed's gaze flitted nervously. It was wise to keep quiet. But you ask around, miss, and you'll see, she whispered. Miss Marple expressed her gratitude to both and departed without any fuss, pondering that when staff were wary of a room, there was always a reason. The only thing hotels dread more than scandal is the truth. As the evening unfolded, the past seemed unwilling to remain hidden while Miss Marple organized her knitting basket. Gladys knocked at her door, her cheeks flushed, her demeanor a mix of eagerness and a hint of guilt, as if she were about to divulge a secret she felt she shouldn't. "It's just," Gladys began, "I thought you ought to know about room 13. This isn't the first time something's happened there." Miss Marple folded her hands with patience. "Do tell me, dear." Gladys glanced around, ensuring their solitude, and continued. "Years ago, long before I started, there was a gentleman staying in room. One morning, he simply vanished." Miss Marple repeated this softly, noting how he left without settling his bill, without packing a single thing. Gladys swallowed hard. Some claimed he walked into the sea. My aunt, who was present at the time, always insisted he must have met a grim fate. "How very peculiar," Miss Marple remarked, her mild politeness masking a keen curiosity. She expressed her gratitude to Gladys and ushered her out. Yet behind her gentle smile, Miss Marple was already convinced that the past had stretched across the years to touch the present. Once again that night, a very deliberate corpse was placed in room 13. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and meticulously considered what she knew. A man had died in a room he wasn't supposed to be in. Confusion over bookings, a misplaced telegram intended for someone with the initial M, and a cloaked figure slipping through the darkness only added to the mystery. Room 13's sinister reputation and a prior disappearance that no one seemed willing to clarify further complicated matters. Miss Marple had faced such messy enigmas before. She believed there were, in her mind, 3 distinct threads to unravel. The possibilities emerged. First, that the deceased had inadvertently wandered into room 13 due to some tragic mishap associated with its previous occupant. Second, that he had intentionally arrived in search of someone or something, possibly linked to the enigmatic M. Or third, and most plausibly, that someone within the hotel was acutely aware of his identity and had cause to dread his arrival. Miss Marple held a steadfast belief in the complexities of human nature: greed, fear, love, guilt. These were the profound motivators, and somewhere concealed amidst the banter and the courteous deceptions, one of these truths lay waiting to be uncovered. Those motives had unlocked the entrance to room 13 and to murder. It was the kind of crisp, pale morning that Miss Marple particularly relished. The garden paths were slightly damp underfoot, and a faint salt breeze stirred the hedges. Guests were still at breakfast, leaving the garden pleasantly deserted. Just as she was admiring a rather overgrown lavender bush, something caught her eye: a dark shape lying awkwardly behind the low stone wall. It was Mr. Pritchard. He lay face down, one hand twisted oddly beneath him, his jacket pulled half off his shoulder. A dark bruise was forming at his temple, and his glasses lay nearby, bent and smeared. Miss Marple knelt with the practical swiftness of someone used to small domestic crises. "Mr. Pritchard," she said firmly, "can you hear me?" There was no reply, but his chest rose faintly beneath his crumpled shirt. It was Gladys, carrying a basket of linens, who came shrieking at the sight. Within minutes, the entire hotel was in an uproar, with Mrs. Sanderford wringing her hands and Colonel Denby offering medically dubious advice about brandy. Miss Marple said nothing, yet her gaze lingered thoughtfully on the grass-stained cuff of Mr. Pritchard's sleeve. She had always observed that those who stumbled by chance tended to fall more gracefully. "Fetch the doctor, dear," she instructed Gladys in her gentlest tone, "and perhaps someone could bring a blanket." As the crowd dispersed into a flurry of activity, Miss Marple remained by the body, her hands folded neatly. Panic blurred the finer points she had come to understand, but she knew that the truth often lay in plain sight for those who watched quietly enough, and there it was. Peeking from the corner of Mr. Pritt's inner pocket was a scrap of worn paper, its edge curling from dampness. Miss Marr's fingers settled lightly on it. Later, the others would recall her comforting words, but none would notice that her calm, gloved hand had slipped the paper free with barely a whisper. The doctor had come and gone, leaving behind his usual collection of solemn pronouncements and unnecessary remedies. Mr. Pritchard, revived but groggy, had been settled in his room while the household buzzed with speculation. Miss Marple sat beside her. Once again, she found herself knitting, the photograph now smoothed and dry, resting quietly on her lap. It was a faded picture taken some years ago, featuring two men standing side by side, squinting slightly against the sun. One was unmistakably Mr. Pritchard, though younger, thinner, with more hair and less stoop. The other was the deceased man from room 13. Her fingers rested lightly on the creased corner where some old handwriting, almost entirely worn away, had once provided a name or place. She did not need to read it. The faces told their own stories, better than ink ever could. It was not entirely a surprise that Mr. Pritchard knew the victim. Miss Mara had already suspected it. But what did surprise her was the look in both men's eyes, a look that spoke not of friendship, but of something much sharper and older. Shared guilt, perhaps, or shared fear. As she folded the photograph and tucked it into her knitting bag, Miss Mara reflected that people who tried to run away from the past often forgot that the past was perfectly capable of catching up. She rose, smooth and resolute. With careful intention, she settled beside Mr. Pritchard's door, sensing that there was something essential she needed to grasp for herself. Mr. Pritchard reclined, supported by a haphazard arrangement of pillows, his complexion reminiscent of cold tea. His hands, perpetually a touch unsteady, twitched against the blanket as Miss Marple affectionately patted his sleeve. "There now," she murmured softly. "You gave us all quite a fright." Mr. Pritchard managed a weak laugh that faltered in his throat. "Foolish of me," he mumbled. "Bit of a dizzy spell." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing. Hands meticulously adjusted the edges of the counterpane, a gesture that appeared soothing yet was subtly designed to prompt conversation. "They'll come back," Mr. Pritchard murmured unexpectedly, his voice barely above a whisper, almost lost in the moment. Miss Marple's hands stilled for just a heartbeat, curiosity piqued. "Who will, dear?" she inquired, but his gaze had already drifted into slumber, leaving her question suspended in the heavy atmosphere. Later, when Miss Marple retreated to her own room, she settled into silence, fingers interlaced thoughtfully. This was not the first time she had encountered such a palpable fear. It was not the fear of someone ensnared in a moment of panic. A deception or the dread of a scandal lingered like an old fear, the sort that people bore for years, a secret burden tucked away until it suddenly emerged, demanding its due. Though fragments remained elusive, Miss Marple understood that this was not simply a twist of fate or a dispute gone awry. It was tied to something far more ancient, something entrenched in history. Whatever had been concealed, Miss Marple sensed it beginning to awaken. She clasped her hands together and granted herself a brief moment of stillness. Satisfaction in human nature was a universal truth she recognized, and once the past was unsettled, it seldom returned to a state of peace. A distinct hush enveloped the royal gull following the doctor's visit, a silence Miss Marple was all too familiar with from her time in St. Mary Mead. It was the kind of quiet that emerged when individuals held more knowledge than they were willing to express, and a sudden fear gripped them that others might share in that understanding. Miss Marple, often regarded as merely a harmless elderly woman, began to attract more scrutinizing glances, particularly from Colonel Denby. Once, she had been the recipient of unwarranted counsel regarding the sea air, but now Mrs. Sander avoided her gaze completely. Her hands, usually steady, trembled noticeably as she refilled Miss Mel's teapot. Even Gladys, who typically required little encouragement to engage in conversation, now provided only brief, anxious replies. It wasn't that Miss Marple believed they suspected her of anything. Rather, it was the unsettling awareness that Miss Marple had observed details they had hoped would remain unnoticed. That evening, as she readied herself for bed, Miss Marple discovered her window left unlatched. Though she distinctly remembered fastening it herself, a small thing, perhaps, but small things had always proven to be rarely accidents. As she sat in her armchair brushing out her hair, there came a soft tap-tap at her door, far too soft to be a porter or guest. Miss Marple said nothing, waiting. After a pause, the footsteps withdrew. Miss Marple folded her brush neatly into her case. It was a curious thing to pass so quietly from observer to target, but Miss Marple had long understood that the most dangerous thing in the world was a person who quietly knew too much. She folded her hands in her lap, composed and reflective, pondering how some desperate soul must be wondering just how much the quiet lady in room 12 had truly witnessed. The Royal Gull had stood for over 50 years, a place where history left its fingerprints for those who knew where to look. Miss Marple, enjoying a quiet tea with the vicar's sister at the local parish hall, discovered precisely the kind of fingerprints she sought. "Oh yes," said Miss Brindle, the vicar's sister, thrilled to have an attentive listener. "Ah, the Royal G had quite the reputation during the war, discreet as it may have been. Yet, everyone was aware of the peculiar happenings." Miss Marple, with her hands folded neatly in her lap and a perfectly mild expression, remarked, "Well, dear, there were strange comings and goings at all hours, men who weren't quite gentlemen, if you catch my drift. And those packages, always those mysterious parcels being carried in and out. My brother insisted it was nothing, of course, but I always suspected smuggling." She spoke softly, her knitting resting untouched beside her. In a respectable hotel, Miss Brindle lowered her voice, suggesting it was not so respectable after all. There was a woman involved, perhaps the manager's wife or niece, if memory serves. They say a falling out occurred just before the war ended. "What kind of falling out?" Miss Brindle leaned forward eagerly. "One of them disappeared, never to be heard from again." "How interesting," said Miss Marple, her tone as mild as ever. Yet her mind was quietly weaving old secrets into new ones, connecting the dots of a disappearance and now a corpse in room 13. It was not proof, not yet. Yet, Miss Marple had long held the belief that in any small community, whether a village or a seaside hotel, the past never truly remained buried. Over the next day, her gentle conversations with the chambermaid, the porter, and even the postmistress quietly wove together a story that no one had wanted to remember. During the early years of the war, the Royal Gull had been conveniently situated close to the sea, far enough from official scrutiny, a perfect stop for coastal smuggling, black market goods, ration luxuries, and even a few sensitive documents. That passed quietly from hand to hand. A few guests had lingered longer than expected, blending in as seaside holidaymakers, yet harboring much darker intentions. Among them was a man named George Marsden, known locally only as GM, a charming, slippery figure, quick with a smile and perpetually late with his payments. "Of course, they said he drowned," said Gladys, polishing silverware with gusto, thrilled to have something worth gossiping about. "He walked into the sea after a deal went awry," they claimed, but even then, there were whispers, Eddie. He leaned over the tea trolley, aided by someone, if you catch my drift. Miss Marple listened intently, her thoughts quietly connecting Marsden's initials to the misplaced telegram intended for M. It seemed the past had indeed returned. "What I never grasped," Gladys remarked, "was why they didn't simply seal that room for eternity." Miss Mel offered a faint smile, explaining that people are often quite practical, dear, and hotel rooms generate income, even if their walls are burdened with too many tales. In room 13, Miss Marple understood that one of those tales was waiting to be uncovered. Returned to claim a final debt, it was the local constable, a cheerful but not particularly sharp fellow, who provided the last piece of the puzzle, though quite by accident. "Funny thing," he said, leaning across the front desk where Miss Marple sat waiting for her evening tea. "Had a telegram this morning from Scotland Yard. They've identified that chap in room 13. "Oh," said Miss Marple, her hands pausing briefly over her knitting. "Name was George Marsden," said the constable. "Apparently went missing after the war, presumed drowned, but looks like he turned up here instead. Poor fellow. Devil." Miss Mar's hands resumed their gentle clicking, her expression placid. "How very unexpected," she said softly. In truth, it was exactly what she had expected. The dead man was the ghost of the hotel's past, walking back into the very room where the trouble had begun. But ghosts did not walk alone. Someone still alive had known who Marsden was. Someone had remembered that unfinished business could not always be left to the tide. Miss Marple rose, thanked the constable, and returned to her seat in the lounge where Mrs. Sanderford sat. With a pale and anxious demeanor, her hands twisted the corner of a frayed linen napkin. Miss Marple offered her a gentle smile. "Such a dreadful business, isn't it?" she said softly. "But the past does have a habit of catching up with us, especially in places like this where the walls have such long memories." Mrs. Sanderford's fingers trembled just slightly, and Miss Marple, quite satisfied, took up her knitting once more. Tomorrow, she would ask a few more questions and perhaps take tea with Mrs. Whittaker. Yet, in her heart, Miss Marple already knew that room 13 had never really. It had been a quiet afternoon tea, the kind of setting where light chatter veils underlying unease. Miss Marple gently guided Mrs. Sanderford into reminiscing. "You must feel quite attached to the hotel," Miss Marple remarked, her tone laced with mild curiosity, having witnessed so many changes. Mrs. Sanderford's smile was thin, a reflection of her family's legacy. "It belongs to my husband's family," she explained. "He took it over just before the war, though that was certainly a challenging time." Miss Marple let her knitting rest lightly in her lap. In the midst of such uncertainty, she murmured with sympathy, particularly for those who had departed. Mrs. Sanford's hands quivered slightly as she poured. "He hadn't gone far. He stayed to assist," he claimed, insisting that someone needed to keep things running. "Then, one day he simply vanished." "Vanished," Miss Merrill echoed softly. "They said he walked out or perhaps took a boat. No one knew for certain. But there were rumors. Of course there always are." Her smile was fragile. "Some suggested it had to do with smuggling, but that's nonsense. He wasn't that sort." Miss Merrill remained silent, her thoughts lingering. Having experienced enough to understand that individuals can change unexpectedly, Mrs. Sanford's voice was strained as she remarked on the silence that followed. "It's challenging to coexist with such a lingering presence," she admitted. Miss Merrill offered a gentle touch, reflecting on the complexity of human nature. "Even those we believe we know intimately can surprise us," she mused. Mrs. Sanford responded with a faint laugh, her gaze drifting toward the sea, as if anticipating a familiar figure emerging from the waves. Later that evening, Miss Merrill discovered Colonel Denby in the familiar armchair, nursing a second brandy and staring into the void. The scene unfolded with an air of peculiar intrigue. "Such a strange business," Miss Merrill remarked as she settled beside him, her knitting needles clicking softly. "I suppose you knew the hotel during the war, Colonel?" The Colonel responded with a non-committal grunt. "Came through a few times, yes. Such odd comings and goings in those days, I imagine," she continued, her tone mild. "All those secret briefings, I expect they needed discreet places." Colonel Den's mustache bristled at the suggestion. "Nothing improper, of course. All above board, officially," Miss Merrill assured him. "While I anticipate that not everyone adhered to the rules, a lengthy silence ensued. Eventually, the Colonel cleared his throat. "Some individuals, well, they had their own arrangements involving illicit goods, a minor side venture." "Really? Smuggling, you mean?" Miss Marple inquired softly. The Colonel's face reddened, yet he offered no denial. Various characters mingled during that time. Civilians rubbed shoulders with officers, and some civilians were hardly more respectable than pirates. Miss Marple's hands glided gracefully over her knitting. "How very intriguing," she remarked. The Colonel continued, stating the truth of the matter. After a moment, "I always suspected Sanderford held deeper knowledge about the smuggling." The Colonel shrugged, yet his expression was taut. When a man vanishes into thin air, there's typically a reason. Miss Merrill offered a faint smile. She understood that human nature had always posed a greater threat than war itself. Alone in her room that night, Miss Merrill unfolded the worn photograph retrieved from Mr. Pritchard's pocket. It was faded, the edges creased from too much handling, but the faces remained vividly clear. Mr. Pritchard stood slightly to one side. Younger, thinner, and wearing a forced smile that suggested a man striving for ease. Beside him stood the deceased from room 13, now identified as George Marsden. Miss Merrill's gaze shifted to the ornate writing at the bottom. The ink had faded, yet two words remained clear: Sanderford, 1943. She folded the photograph again, with care and intention. There was no longer any doubt George Marsden had known the Sanderfords, and Mr. Pritchard had known them as well, not as innocent holidaymakers, but as men entangled in the shadow of a long-forgotten crime. Miss Merrill pondered that, in her experience, there was no such thing as a truly forgotten crime, only those waiting patiently to be recalled. The next morning, she would pose a few incisive questions, but deep down, she already understood that the corpse in room 133 had not arrived by mere chance. It had come to settle old accounts, and someone within the Royal Gull had ensured that those accounts were closed for good. It was Gladys, pale and trembling with excitement, who delivered the news to Miss Marple over breakfast. "She's gone, Miss Gladys," whispered, leaning much too close to the table, packed a bag, and slipped away into the night. Miss Marple set down her spoon and folded her hands. "That seems rather sudden, dear Gladys." His eyes darted towards the doorway, half expecting Mrs. Sandford to reappear like a guilty ghost. And she left this. She placed a trembling envelope on the table, addressed in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. "For Miss Marple, private, please." With quiet precision, Miss Marple opened the note. The paper, thin and hotel issue, was stained. At the edges where Mrs. Sandford's fingers had gripped it too tightly, the message inside was short but laden with fear. "Miss Marple, you are the only one who understands. Please protect the innocent. The past has caught up with me, and I cannot face it. Forgive me." There was no signature, only a faint smudge where the pen had trembled and caught on the paper. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but inwardly she felt that familiar sense of inevitability, the sense that came when the past, long repressed, finally forced its way to the surface. Itself to the surface, Mrs. Sandford was not the first woman to flee from old ghosts, nor would she be the last. "What shall we do?" Miss Gladys asked, breathless with anticipation. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Nothing at all, my dear. People who run away from trouble rarely get very far." Yet, even as she spoke, Miss Marple's mind was already grappling with something far more pressing: the identity of the innocent Mrs. Sandford wished to protect. For in Miss Marple's considerable experience, no one ever vanishes alone. They always leave traces behind. Something or someone behind it was Colonel Denby, blustering and red-faced, who produced the forgotten handbag later that morning. "Left it right here on the hall table," he declared, as though single-handedly solving the case. "Dashing, careless if you ask me." Miss Mell accepted the bag with quiet interest. It was worn, the clasp slightly loose, a bag used by a woman who had once taken pride in her appearance but had since grown too tired to care. Without fuss or drama, Miss Marple opened it and began examining the contents. A handkerchief embroidered with SS, a half-empty tin of peppermints, and at the very bottom, a key ring. There were several ordinary keys, the kind used for linen cupboards and pantry doors, but it was the heaviest key that caught Miss Marple's attention. Slightly tarnished, it bore an old brass tag marked simply Room 13, Master Key. For a moment, Miss Mell's fingers rested lightly on the key, her mind turning over the quiet but damning significance of it. The key, long forgotten at the bottom of Mrs. Sandford's bag, was not the key to her. Neither her own room nor her office. It was the key that could reveal every hidden chamber 13 had guarded since the war. Miss Mell delicately placed her hands over the bag. The past had not merely caught up with Mrs. Sandford, it had come knocking at her very door. "It's amusing how keys can hold such memories," Miss Marple observed gently to Colonel Denby, her tone as gentle as ever. Colonel Denby, as expected, appeared puzzled. Miss Marple chose not to elaborate. She understood with a quiet certainty that the tale was far more intricate. Room 13 remained incomplete, and if the key could talk, it would surely share an intriguing story. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her room, her knitting idle in her lap. The handbag abandoned by Mrs. Sandford, the master key to Room 13, and the faded photograph from Mr. Pritchard's pocket were arranged neatly on the small table beside her. Together, they created a puzzle, and Miss Marple had always had a fondness for puzzles, especially those crafted from human folly. She mentally sifted through the facts, each piece falling into place seamlessly. Stitches in a familiar pattern. George Marsden, a notorious wartime smuggler, had returned to Room 13 not out of nostalgia, but because he understood it was the designated space for another individual, someone he planned to confront. But who was this intended occupant? Miss Marple recalled the shuffled room assignments Mrs. Sandford had mentioned so anxiously, the booking mix-up, the confusion surrounding the telegram for M, and the cloak and dagger whispers from years gone by. All of these elements pointed to a singular conclusion. Marsden had intended to meet Mr. Sandford, a man whose own disappearance was shrouded in mystery. Had long been the hotel's unspoken secret, yet the true Sandford had never made an appearance. Instead, Marsden found himself in a room with the wrong man, Mr. Pritchard, who, by a cruel twist of fate, shared his own wartime connection to Din, though not the one Din had anticipated. The misunderstanding turned deadly when someone, in a state of panic at Marsden's return, mistook Pritchard for the intended threat. Miss Marple sighed softly. Human beings, she mused, were dreadfully predictable when gripped by fear. In the throes of old anxieties, they seldom took a moment to confirm who they were truly afraid of. The wrong man was dead, while the right man, whoever Mrs. Sanderford had meant to protect, was still very much alive. If the killer had realized their mistake, Miss Marple folded her hands, quite composed. There was still time, perhaps, if only just, to prevent a second, more deliberate crime. The following morning, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Whitaker, her manner as serene as ever over buttered scones and weak Darjeeling. Miss Marple guided the conversation ever so gently toward wartime memories. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Whitaker said, stirring her tea with dramatic fervor, "the actions of people in those days were shrouded in secrecy and laced with an awful fear. No one ever knew whom to trust. Fear is such a powerful thing." Miss Marple agreed softly, "especially when one's own secrets feel dangerously close to resurfacing." Mrs. Whitaker's eyes flickered for just a moment with something akin to guilt. "Of course," she said, her tone a bit too quick, "but those days are long past." Miss Mell said nothing, for she understood that they were not past at all. The murder in room 13 had, emerging directly from the fears held tightly for 3 decades by an individual unable to let past betrayals fade, a shadow loomed. A life had been taken to silence a specter, only to reveal that the wrong specter had been silenced entirely. Yet, the fear that Miss Marple understood would not allow such a perpetrator to simply cease their actions. The true peril still lay ahead, for the one individual they continued to dread was very much alive. Before the day concluded, Miss Marple was determined to unveil precisely who that person was. There was an oddly ceremonial quality to the manner in which Miss Marple had extended the invitation. Guests were invited to assemble in the sitting room, each note crafted with impeccable politeness, suggesting a casual afternoon tea rather than a gathering to unveil a murderer. The attendees arrived, each displaying a mix of curiosity and unease. Colonel Denby positioned himself by the mantelpiece, hands firmly clasped behind his back, as if bracing for a court-martial. Gladys lingered near the door, breathless with anticipation, her apron slightly askew. Mr. Pritchard sat rigidly, his eyes flitting between Miss Morley and the door, contemplating a possible escape. Mrs. Whitaker settled herself comfortably, exuding a serene self-assurance, though her fingers plucked at the hem of her sleeve with nervous energy. Miss Marple, her knitting placed neatly in her lap, began without preamble. "It is such a dreadful thing, isn't it?" she said softly, "when the past simply refuses to remain buried." Her tone was gentle, her smile faint, but there was a sharpness behind the softness, like a needle hidden in wool. She looked around the room, her eyes kind but piercing, as though seeing not only the guests but the secrets layered beneath the surface. Underneath their courteous facades, now that we've had a moment to reflect, Miss Marple continued, "I believe it's time we speak quite frankly about what truly transpired in room 13. With the composure of someone discussing the weather or embroidery patterns, Miss Marple began to unravel the truth, stitch by stitch. "It all begins," she said softly, "with something that occurred a long time ago during the war." She smoothed her skirt and cast a brief glance toward Mrs. Sanford's empty chair, remembering Mrs. Sanford's husband, a man much. Public admiration concealed a web of less savory undertakings, including smuggling and dealings in the black market. "I have my suspicions regarding the disappearance of a former associate." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, yet the certainty in her voice was unmistakable. George Marsden, the man discovered lifeless in room 13, was one such associate. He was fully aware of the Sanderfords' actions and returned not merely for justice, but for profit. He intended to blackmail Mrs. Sanderford, confident she would pay a hefty price to safeguard her late husband's reputation. Miss Marple's fingers tapped thoughtfully, gently on the arm of her chair, but those who manipulate others are seldom patient, and Mrs. Sanderford, already burdened by her husband's secrets, must have felt a deep sense of urgency. She paused just long enough for the weight of the word to envelop the room. Desperation, Miss Marple added quietly, often leads to desperate mistakes. She glanced toward the staircase, where Mrs. Sanderford's absence lingered heavily in the air. And so, Miss Marple said softly, the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. But you see, Miss Marple continued, the most tragic element of this whole the affair was the essence of room 13 itself. As she folded her hands neatly, there was, you may recall, a last-minute shuffle of room assignments, a small administrative oversight, perhaps, or perhaps not. Her gaze lingered briefly on Colonel Denby. In any case, the room George Marsden believed to be occupied by Mrs. Sanford's confidant, her partner in past crimes, was in fact occupied by Mr. Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard gave a visible start, his teacup rattling in its saucer. You see, Miss Marple said kindly, Marsden's plan to confront his old enemy went tragically awry as he burst into room 13, expecting to find someone from his past, but instead encountered a stranger. She let the silence linger, with only the crackle of the fire breaking the stillness. The wrong man was murdered, yet in a way, the right man too, for Mr. Pritchard held his own ties to those war years, didn't he? A connection no one dared to discuss. Miss Merrill smiled gently, the kind of smile that comes from finally understanding why someone has been so deeply afraid. And so she said softly, the threads began to intertwine as Miss Merrill's gaze shifted to Mrs. Whittaker, who had gone quite still. You see, Miss Merrill said, there was always one curious question. Who exactly was so desperately afraid that George Mazen's return would expose secrets best left buried? She let the question linger before answering it herself. It was you, Mrs. Whittaker. The widow gave a brittle laugh, but her fingers clenched her handkerchief tightly. Tell me what nonsense. Why should I? Because you were in love with one of the smugglers, Miss Merrill said softly, a man who placed his trust in you, sharing secrets that held the power to destroy him. When Marsden returned, your concern extended beyond your own safety. It encompassed the memory of the man you once cherished. Mrs. Whittaker's gaze flickered toward the door, yet Miss Marple's soothing voice persisted, steady and unyielding. You believed Marsden sought vengeance, or perhaps intended to silence you with funds you lacked. Thus, you took action. Her smile carried a hint of sorrow. That night, you slipped into room 13, didn't you? In the midst of darkness and dread, you ended up taking the wrong life. Mrs. Whittaker's handkerchief slipped from her grasp and fluttered to the floor. Love and fear, Miss Merrill murmured. They compel people to act in the most remarkable ways. The room held its breath, the only sounds being the crackling fire and the gentle murmur of the sea outside the windows. You see, Miss Merrill continued softly, many think greed is the source of most crimes, but in my experience, it is fear and love that push individuals to their most extreme behaviors. She arranged her hands with care. Mrs. Whittaker cherished a man whose history was less than pristine, while Mrs. Sanford was consumed by the dread of her husband's secrets. Secrets threatened to unravel the life she had painstakingly reconstructed. She surveyed the room, her expression a blend of gentle apprehension, fear of scandal, fear of loss, fear of exposure. It was all so profoundly human. Mrs. Whittaker's voice dropped to a whisper. I only wanted to protect him, she confessed, even after all these years. Miss Merrill nodded softly, acknowledging that even love, even when misguided, wields immense power. She smoothed her skirt, reflecting that ultimately, the past has a way of catching up with us. It matters not if it's a village post office or a seaside hotel. Human nature, I'm afraid, remains constant. Everywhere, Colonel Denby cleared his throat, yet silence reigned. Miss Cole, tucking her knitting under her arm, added one final thought. Fear and guilt, she said, are far more dangerous than mere greed because they never let go. By mid-morning, the guests at the Royal Gull had resumed their routines, albeit with slightly more liveliness than before. The excitement of a real murder, complete with a dramatic reveal by the quietly formidable Miss Merrill, was the sort of tale they would all recount for years to come. Colonel Denby flushed with relief at not being implicated was evident as one enthusiastically offered to teach Gladys the finer points of cigar ash analysis. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whittaker, pale yet composed, sat in her usual chair by the window, gazing at the sea with a peculiar wistfulness. Mr. Pritchard had retreated to his room with a cup of strong tea, while Gladys, bursting with gleeful gossip, relayed her stories to anyone willing to listen. Miss Marple, on the other hand, sat quietly knitting, her hands perfectly steady, as if murder and smuggling were no more troubling than a slightly dropped stitch. Her expression, however, was not one of complete satisfaction. There was a loose thread, a tiny irregularity that continued to prick at her mind. She was, after all, a firm believer that human nature tended toward the untidy. The official version of events might now be settled, but in her considerable experience, there was always one last knot to untangle. And sure enough, it arrived in the form of Gladys, breathless and eager, bearing a cup of tea and a curious observation. "It was the key," Miss Gladys said, her voice dropping to in a hushed tone, "I almost overlooked it amidst the whirlwind of events." Miss Marple glanced up, her knitting momentarily halted. "The key, dear," she said softly. "Yes, Mississippi. The key to Mrs. Sandford's room. She left it at the front desk the very night she, well, vanished." Miss Mell offered a faint yet reassuring smile. "That does seem peculiar, doesn't it? One rarely forgets a room key when planning to slip away into the night." Gladys nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And the curious part is, I remember it distinctly because she left it all polished, as if she wanted to avoid leaving any fingerprints." Miss Marple murmured her approval, her mind quietly turning over this unexpected detail in her experience. Truly, fearful people often try to tidy up their own mistakes, a futile effort. Of course, since fear leaves far deeper traces than mere fingerprints. No one saw her leave. Not a soul, Gladys declared. Just the key sitting there, all shiny and strange. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, the needles clicking gently in her hands, though her thoughts were already elsewhere, sifting through the implications of Gladys's simple observation were clear. The key had not been left behind by accident. Miss Marple, suddenly quite certain, moved with her usual unassuming grace as she took a quiet walk down the corridor after tea. She paused at Mrs. Sandford's empty room, her gloved hand resting lightly on the doorknob. There had been no luggage taken, no last-minute departure arrangements, not even a whispered farewell to Gladys. Mrs. Sandford's disappearance had been far too neat, a performance stage for the benefit of those who might be watching. Observing Miss Marple, a subtle smile graced her lips. She had witnessed this scene countless times before, the disappearing act of a woman paralyzed by fear, yet too dignified to admit it. She glided silently toward the narrow service staircase, the one frequented by chambermaids and delivery boys. This path, as she knew from instinct and experience, led to a place no guest would ever choose to visit, the hotel's attic. It took mere seconds to lift the latch and peer inside, revealing Mrs. Sandford herself, pale and trembling, huddled among old trunks and forgotten deck chairs, clutching a worn photograph of her long-dead husband. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Sandford whispered, her voice ragged with exhaustion and relief. "You found me." Miss Marple stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. "My dear," she said kindly, "you mustn't worry. It's all quite over now." But Mrs. Sandford shook her head, her eyes bright with lingering terror. "It's never over, is it? Not when you've lived with fear for so long." Mrs. Sandford's hands trembled in her lap, twisting her handkerchief until the delicate lace tore. "They said the war ended," whispered, "yet it remained unspoken for us, for those who understood the hidden truths." Miss Marple sat beside her, a steady presence akin to a lifelong confidant. "Fear does settle into the bones," she said gently. "But fear, you know, is like a ghost. It can only harm you if you allow it." Mrs. Sandford let out a brittle laugh. "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple, dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft yet firm, "but possible." She took the torn handkerchief, folding it with neat fingers, as if tidying away both fabric and fear. "The truth is always less frightening than the tales we weave in the shadows." Mrs. Sandford remained silent, her hold on the handkerchief gradually easing. Miss Marple extended her hand, encouragingly. "Come along, my dear. The past can't harm you if you move toward it instead of fleeing." After a brief moment of uncertainty, Mrs. Sandford accepted Miss Marple's hand. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stood on the blustery promenade, observing the tide inching up the shore. The seaside air was crisp yet refreshing, a breeze that bore both memory and possibility. Gladys, standing beside her, wrapped her cardigan tighter and gave a contented sigh. Well, that's all over. Mississippi imagined smugglers and murder right here in our little hotel. Miss Marple's smile was faintly wistful. It's a curious thing, Gladys, but in my experience, the setting changes far more than the people. Gladys tilted her head. How do you mean, miss? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the horizon. In St. Mary, it might be a quarrel over a rose bush or a disputed will. In a seaside hotel, it's old crimes washed ashore by the tide, but human nature, my dear, is remarkably consistent. Gladys gave a little shiver, but Miss Mel's voice remained calm. Fear, love, guilt, all those little weaknesses that lead people to lie, betray, and sometimes even kill, they're the same in a village as they are in a grand hotel. She turned away from the sea. The matter settled in her mind. Only the scenery changes. With that, Miss Marple walked back toward the hotel, her step as light and untroubled as ever, while the waves carried the past out to sea.